December 23rd, 1944, 9 p.m. The Arizona desert stretches black and infinite beyond the barbed wire of Camp Papago Park. Inside Compound 1, the officers' quarters, a raucous Christmas party erupts with drunken singing and shouting. Guards watching from their towers roll their eyes. The Germans have been celebrating the news from the Ardennes forest for a week now, where their countrymen have launched a massive offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. But this party serves a darker purpose. Every boisterous chorus of Deutschland über alles masks the scraping of boots against earth, the grunting of men pulling themselves through 178 feet of cramped, muddy tunnel. One by one, 25 German naval officers and enlisted men emerge from a concealed hole beside the cross-cut canal, shaking dirt from their civilian clothes, clutching survival packs stuffed with bacon, cigarettes, forged identification papers, and handmade compasses fashioned from magnetized sewing needles. Among them are 6 U-boat commanders, men who had terrorized Allied shipping across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Mediterranean. Men who had sent tens of thousands of tons of vessels to the bottom of the sea. Men who had survived depth charges, air attacks, and the crushing pressure of emergency dives. Now, they face a different enemy entirely. Captain Wilhelm Gunther and Lieutenants Wolfgang Claras and Friedrich Uzzolino drag something extraordinary through the darkness. A collapsible raft they had spent weeks constructing in secret from wood scraps and pieces of rubber, designed to fold compact enough to carry through the tunnel. Their plan is elegant in its simplicity. They will launch this craft into the Salt River, visible as a thick blue line on the maps they had acquired. From the Salt, they will float to the Gila River, then to the Colorado, and finally into the Gulf of California. Mexico lies just 130 miles to the south. Freedom, they believe, is a matter of paddling. The 3 men move swiftly through the December night, their breath misting in the cold desert air, the unfamiliar terrain of Arizona spreading before them like the surface of an alien planet. They are sailors, men whose entire professional lives had been spent surrounded by water, men who understood currents and tides, who could navigate by stars across thousands of miles of featureless ocean. The desert presents no challenge that proper German planning and determination cannot overcome. By 2:30 a.m. on December 24th, Christmas Eve, all 25 escapees have cleared the tunnel and dispersed into the darkness. They split into 10 small groups, each with its own route toward Mexico. The guards in their towers notice nothing unusual. The singing has died down in Compound 1, but Germans going to sleep after a party is hardly cause for alarm. It won't be until 7 p.m. the following evening, nearly 22 hours later, that Captain Cecil Parshall will confirm what he already suspected. The most elaborate escape in American POW history has succeeded. But the three sailors, with their carefully constructed raft, are about to make a discovery that will transform their daring escape into something else entirely. Something that will reveal, in the starkest possible terms, the fatal flaw in their meticulous planning. Because the salt river they had studied so carefully on their maps, that reassuring blue line promising a watery highway to freedom, exists only on paper. In the Arizona desert, blue lines often lie. To understand how 25 German naval officers came to be dragging a homemade raft through the Sonoran Desert on Christmas Eve, 1944, you must first understand the man who orchestrated it all, Captain Jürgen Wattenberg, one of the most remarkable and troublesome prisoners the United States military had ever encountered. Wattenberg's story reads like a wartime adventure novel, except every word of it is documented fact. Born in Lübeck in December 1900, he had joined the German Navy as a young man and risen steadily through the ranks. By the outbreak of World War II, he served aboard one of Germany's most prestigious warships, the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, a technological marvel designed specifically to raid Allied commerce across the vast expanses of the Atlantic. In December 1939, the Graf Spee found herself cornered in the estuary of the River Plate off Montevideo, Uruguay, after a running battle with 3 British cruisers. Outgunned and outmaneuvered, with British reinforcements steaming toward the scene, Captain Hans Langsdorff faced an impossible choice. He could not allow his ship to fall into enemy hands, could not risk his crew in a hopeless breakout attempt. On December 17, 1939, watched by 20,000 spectators lining the Montevideo waterfront, the Graf Spee's crew set off explosive charges and scuttled their own ship in the shallow waters of the estuary. Langsdorff shot himself 3 days later. But Wattenberg refused to surrender. While over 1,000 of his crewmates were interned in Argentina, Wattenberg escaped. He made his way across South America, eventually returning to Germany to a hero's welcome in May 1940. Most men would have accepted a desk job after such an ordeal. Wattenberg volunteered for U-boat service. At 41 years old, he became one of the oldest U-boat commanders of the entire war when he took command of U-162 in September 1941. Over the next year, he would prove himself devastatingly effective, sinking 14 Allied ships, totaling over 82,000 tons in just 3 combat patrols. His hunting grounds stretched from the North Sea to the Caribbean to the coast of South America. On his 3rd patrol, his luck finally ran out. On September 3, 1942, northeast of Trinidad, 3 British destroyers detected U-162 and attacked with depth charges. The submarine went down with 2 men killed. Wattenberg and 48 survivors were pulled from water and became prisoners for the second time in the war. The Americans inherited him from the British, and he immediately became a problem. Classified as a super-Nazi by military intelligence, Wattenberg moved from camp to camp because no one wanted to keep him. He organized disruptions, challenged authority, and constantly probed for weaknesses in security. By January 1944, desperate to put him somewhere he couldn't cause trouble, the Army transferred him to Camp Papago Park in Arizona. The desert, they reasoned, was escape-proof. The ground was rock-hard caliche, impossible to tunnel through. The nearest border was 130 miles away through some of the most hostile terrain in North America. What they failed to realize was that they had just concentrated every troublemaker, every escape-prone officer, every determined resistor into a single compound. And leading them was a man who had already escaped captivity once before, who had already proven he would never simply accept imprisonment, who had survived the scuttling of the Graf Spee and the sinking of his U-boat. Within hours of his arrival, Wattenberg began planning. The German prisoners called Camp Papago Park Schlaraffenland, the land of milk and honey. Compared to the brutal conditions endured by Allied prisoners in German and Japanese camps, the description was not entirely ironic. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, and the United States took those requirements seriously, partly out of genuine commitment to international law, partly in hopes that Germany would reciprocate with American prisoners. The camp sprawled across the northeastern portion of Papago Park, surrounded by the distinctive red sandstone buttes and saguaro cacti of the Sonoran Desert. Originally built for Italian prisoners in 1943, it had been redesignated for German naval personnel by early 1944. At its peak, over 3,000 men lived behind the barbed wire, most of them Kriegsmarine sailors captured from sunken U-boats across the Atlantic. Life in the camp possessed a surreal quality. Prisoners were not required to work, though many volunteered for labor details simply to escape the monotony. They formed an orchestra, staged theatrical productions, watched Hollywood movies twice a week in the camp theater, and published their own newspaper, the Papago Rundschau. They kept rabbits, chickens, and an Irish setter as pets. They painted watercolors of the alien desert landscape. They brewed contraband beer and liquor from their food rations and held raucous parties that drove their American guards to distraction. The food astounded men who had spent months at sea on dwindling submarine rations. Fresh meat, vegetables, white bread, real coffee. When the 25 escapees fled into the desert carrying slabs of bacon and packs of cigarettes, local newspapers erupted with outrage. American civilians couldn't get bacon for weeks at a time due to rationing, yet German prisoners of war apparently had it in abundance. But beneath the relatively comfortable surface, Camp Papago Park suffered from serious security deficiencies that Wattenberg recognized immediately. Captain Cecil Parshall, the camp's provost marshal, had warned his superiors about concentrating troublesome prisoners together in Compound 1. He had pointed out a critical blind spot, an area near the bathhouse, that no guard tower could observe directly. His warnings went unheeded. The American camp commander made what would prove a catastrophic error in judgment.
Rather than dispersing the most escape-prone officers throughout the camp's 5 compounds, he housed them all together in Compound 1. Wattenberg found himself surrounded by kindred spirits. Friedrich Guggenberger, the Knight's Cross holder, who had sunk the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Hans-Werner Krauss, whose U-199 had gone down off the Brazilian coast. Jürgen Wattenberg, captured when U-595 was lost in the Mediterranean. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were the elite of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm, men selected for intelligence, determination, and the psychological resilience to survive months of combat beneath the sea. The Americans believed the Arizona desert itself provided sufficient security. They looked at the rock-hard ground and declared tunneling impossible. They looked at the 130 miles of brutal terrain between the camp and Mexico and concluded no escaped prisoner could survive the journey. They were about to learn how badly they had underestimated German engineering and German stubbornness. Work on the tunnel began in September 1944, operating out of the blind spot Wattenberg had identified beside the bathhouse in Compound 1. The entrance was concealed behind a removable section of the bathhouse wall, hidden by a large coal box that prisoners could easily shift aside. When guards saw men heading to the bathhouse for showers, they thought nothing of it. They had no idea that some of those men were descending into a vertical shaft and crawling into an ever-lengthening horizontal passage aimed toward the cross-cut canal just beyond the eastern perimeter fence. The Americans had given Wattenberg the tools he needed. He had requested shovels and rakes for the prisoners' gardens and for the construction of a volleyball court. Because everyone knew Arizona's Caliche soil was too hard to tunnel through, the guards saw no reason to refuse. Each evening, the tools were dutifully returned to storage, and each night they were put to use underground. 3 teams of 3 men worked in 90-minute shifts. 1 man dug with a pick and coal shovel, breaking through the stubborn earth. A second gathered the loosened soil into buckets. A third pulled the buckets out and kept watch. A 4th team disposed of the excavated material. At first, they flushed it down toilets, hid it in attic spaces, or dropped it down their trouser legs to scatter in the camp gardens. But as the tunnel lengthened and the soil accumulated, they adopted a bolder strategy. They spread it openly on the volleyball court they were supposedly constructing. Guards walked past piles of fresh earth every day and never thought to question where it came from. The tunnel extended 178 feet from the bathhouse to an exit beside the cross-cut canal, with a 6-foot vertical entrance shaft. Wooden beams reinforced the walls. Makeshift ventilation pipes provided fresh air to the diggers working at the far end. The prisoners even constructed a concealed plug that could seal the tunnel entrance, allowing it to be used repeatedly without discovery. While the diggers worked, others prepared the materials necessary for survival after the escape. Some obtained civilian clothing through extraordinary means, actually ordering items from a Sears catalog delivered by U.S. mail. Others forged identification papers, creating fake driver's licenses, work permits, and ration cards using techniques the U-boat officers had learned during their naval training. They embossed seals from improvised stamps and aged paper with tea stains to give documents the appearance of authenticity. They assembled navigation aids, handmade compasses from magnetized sewing needles floated on water or attached to razor blade dials, carefully calibrated against known directions. They scraped together small amounts of American currency by trading handcrafted Nazi memorabilia to guards willing to overlook regulations. And 3 men built a boat. Captain Wilhelm Gunther, Lieutenant Wolfgang Claris, and Lieutenant Friedrich Uzzolino spent weeks constructing a collapsible raft from wood scraps and pieces of rubber, designed to be assembled once they reached the water. They tested it secretly in a small compound pond. It floated. Their navigation was simple. Follow the blue line on the map marked Salt River, southwest to its junction with the Gila River, then continue to the Colorado, and finally into the Gulf of California. The total distance by water would be over 300 miles, but they were sailors. Distance meant nothing to men who had crossed the Atlantic in submarines. The escape date was set for Saturday, December 23, 1944. Wattenberg had negotiated a compromise with camp authorities regarding roll call, ensuring that no count would occur between Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning. Combined with the Christmas holiday skeleton crew, this created a window of opportunity that might not come again. They descended into the tunnel at 9 p.m., while their compatriots in adjacent compounds threw the loudest party the camp had ever heard. The 3 boatmen emerged from the tunnel carrying their folded raft and made their way to the cross-cut canal. The night was cold, clear, and moonless, perfect conditions for movement. They followed the canal south toward the point where their maps showed it intersecting with the Salt River, that beautiful blue line promising a highway of water stretching all the way to Mexico. What they found was sand. The Salt River, which once flowed year-round through the Phoenix Valley, had been tamed decades earlier by a series of dams, beginning with the Theodore Roosevelt Dam in 1911. The Granite Reef Diversion Dam captured virtually all the remaining water for agricultural irrigation, channeling it into the Arizona Canal and Southern Canal systems. Below the dam, the riverbed was dry, except after heavy rainfall. In December 1944, there had been no significant rain. The great river that German cartographers had faithfully recorded on their maps was nothing but a sandy wash, a broad arroyo stretching empty and mocking across the desert floor. The 3 men stood in the darkness, their carefully constructed raft suddenly transformed from an escape vehicle into dead weight. Everything they had planned for, everything they had built, was predicated on that blue line being water. An Arizona native would have laughed at the assumption. Everyone who lived in the Phoenix Valley knew that the rivers shown on maps were usually dry riverbeds, that water in the desert was precious and controlled, that the blue lines on federal maps did not distinguish between flowing rivers and seasonal washes. But these men were not Arizona natives. They were sailors from the green and rainy landscapes of Germany, where rivers ran year-round, and a blue line on a map meant water as surely as the sun meant daylight. They had no frame of reference for rivers that simply ceased to exist outside of rainy seasons. The concept was as foreign to them
as the saguaro cacti they stumbled past in the darkness. They made a decision that revealed both their determination and their desperation. They would carry the raft to the Gila River. Perhaps the Gila would have water where the salt did not. They trudged southwest through the unfamiliar desert, hauling their useless boat, covering approximately 20 miles before the futility became undeniable. The Gila River was as dry as the salt, another sandy bed stretching toward the horizon. One of the men later admitted the painful truth that any local resident could have told them. They had no idea that a river in Arizona, despite being marked in blue on a map, might contain water only after significant rainfall. The very foundation of their escape plan had been built on a cartographic misunderstanding. They destroyed the raft rather than carry it any farther, and continued on foot toward Gila Bend. What had been planned as a relatively comfortable water journey now became a grueling desert march for which they were completely unprepared. And somewhere along a canal near Gila Bend, Friedrich Utsolino made a fateful decision. His underclothes were dirty and uncomfortable. He decided to wash them. He hung them to dry on a mesquite tree beside the water. Cowboys spotted the laundry on January 8, 1945, and alerted authorities. The three crazy boatmen, as they would later be called, were back in custody. The escape triggered
what the Phoenix Gazette called the greatest manhunt in Arizona history. When Captain Parshall confirmed on Christmas Eve that prisoners were missing, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Several hundred soldiers deployed across Maricopa County. FBI agents arrived from regional offices. Border Patrol units intensified coverage of the Mexican frontier. Local sheriff's deputies and police officers joined the search. And perhaps most significantly, 2 Tohono O'odham scouts were recruited for their unparalleled knowledge of the desert terrain. The Army offered a $25 reward for each escaped prisoner returned to custody, the equivalent of roughly $450 in today's money. The incentive drew farmers, ranchers, and curious civilians into the hunt, all of them scanning the desert for signs of the fugitive Germans. Most of the escapees discovered very quickly that the Arizona desert was far more dangerous than any Atlantic convoy or Mediterranean patrol. The temperature dropped dramatically at night, leaving men who had prepared for a brief water journey shivering in inadequate clothing. The terrain was brutal and disorienting, rocky hills and sandy washes that all looked identical in the darkness. Food and water were scarce, and the Germans had no knowledge of desert survival techniques, no understanding of which plants might be edible or where hidden water sources might exist. They were sailors lost in an ocean of sand and rock, completely out of their element. Herbert Fuchs, a 22-year-old submarine crewman, lasted exactly 1 day. Cold, wet, hungry, and utterly miserable, he walked into the local sheriff's office on December 24th and surrendered. He had seen the Christmas dinner menu posted at the camp before his escape, and after a night in the desert,
The prospect of turkey, ham, and all the trimmings suddenly seemed far more appealing than freedom. Several more prisoners surrendered that same day, some of them knocking on farmhouse doors and politely asking the startled residents to telephone the police. By December 26th, 6 escapees were back in custody. The numbers continued to climb through the new year. On January 1st, 1945, Tohono O'odham scouts captured 2 unnamed prisoners less than 30 miles from the Mexican border, tantalizingly close to freedom, but unable to cover those final miles through unfamiliar terrain. Shortly afterward, Captain Lieutenants Friedrich Guggenberger and Jürgen Wattenberg, 2 of the most decorated U-boat commanders in the group, were apprehended within 10 miles of Mexico. They had traveled 170 miles from the camp, an extraordinary achievement given the conditions, but the border remained just out of reach. The search concentrated on the southern routes toward Mexico, but not all the escapees had headed south. The 3 sailors with the destroyed raft were captured at Gila Bend. Other pairs and individuals were picked up across Maricopa County as hunger, cold, and exposure took
their toll. But 3 men remained at large, including the man who had planned the entire operation. While most escapees fled south toward Mexico, Jürgen Wattenberg made a different calculation. He understood that search efforts would concentrate on the border, that every road south would be watched, every desert crossing patrolled. Instead of running toward freedom, he ran toward concealment. Wattenberg, accompanied by 2 subordinates from his U-boat days, Walter Korsur and Johann Kramer, hiked north into the mountains. They followed a ravine into Crown Canyon, north of Phoenix, where rocky boulders and overhanging outcrops promised concealment. There, beneath a natural stone shelter, they stacked smaller rocks to create a cave-like refuge and prepared to wait out the manhunt. Their strategy was sophisticated. Rather than attempting an immediate break for Mexico, they would let the initial frenzy die down, resupply from contacts still inside the camp, and eventually make their escape when search efforts had relaxed. Before the escape, Wattenberg had arranged for sympathetic German prisoners on outside work details to leave food and supplies in an abandoned vehicle at a predetermined location. Johann Kramer would periodically retrieve these caches, keeping the 3 fugitives supplied with provisions. But Kramer grew bolder than the plan required. Rather than simply collecting supplies, he began infiltrating prisoner work crews sent outside the camp, exchanging places with other German workers, and actually returning to the camp itself. Inside the wire, he gathered food, information, and news about the ongoing manhunt. He would then rejoin an outside work detail and slip away back to the mountain cave. The audacity of the scheme was remarkable. An escaped prisoner repeatedly entering and leaving the very camp he had fled from, right under the noses of guards who were supposed to be on heightened alert. The 3 men even ventured into downtown Phoenix itself on at least 2 occasions, walking the streets of the city that was hunting them, observing American life up close, completely anonymous in the crowds. But the scheme unraveled on January 22nd, 1945, when a surprise inspection revealed Kramer's presence inside the camp. He must have provided information to his captors, because the following night Soldiers waited at the abandoned vehicle that served as the supply drop. Walter Kossur walked into the trap and was arrested. Now Wattenberg was truly alone. His two companions were back in custody. His supply line was compromised. His mountain refuge was likely known to the authorities. After over a month of evasion, his options had finally run out. On January 27, 1945, Wattenberg cleaned himself up as best he could and hiked the 7 miles into downtown Phoenix. He had 75 cents in his pocket, most of which he spent on a meal at a restaurant. Exhausted from weeks of living rough, he found a hotel lobby and fell asleep in a chair.
A few hours. Later that night, walking the streets, he encountered a member of a street cleaning crew and asked for directions. His English was excellent, polished during his time in American custody. But something about his accent struck the street cleaner as wrong. Perhaps it was too formal, too precise, lacking the casual contractions and regional inflections of a native speaker. The cleaner called the police. By 9 a.m. on January 28, 1945, 36 days after crawling through a muddy tunnel into the Arizona night, Captain Jürgen Wattenberg was back in custody. The greatest manhunt in Arizona history was over. All 25 escapees had been recaptured without a single shot fired. The escaped prisoners expected harsh punishment. They knew what happened to Allied prisoners who attempted escape from German camps. Just months earlier, 50 RAF officers had been executed by the Gestapo after tunneling out of Stalag Luft III in what became known as the Great Escape. The Germans assumed American retribution would be equally severe. Instead, their punishment was almost absurdly lenient. Bread and water rations for as many days as each man had been absent from the camp. Wattenberg, who had been at large for 36 days, received 36 days of reduced rations. The American guards faced no serious consequences. The FBI launched an investigation into security lapses at Arizona prisoner of war camps, but no careers were destroyed, no commanders were relieved. The contrast highlighted something the German prisoners found difficult to comprehend. The Americans genuinely adhered to the Geneva Convention's rules regarding prisoner treatment, not because they feared German reprisals against American POWs, but because they believed the rules were right. The escape had been embarrassing. The security failures had been genuine, but executing or seriously punishing prisoners for attempting to escape would have violated both international law and American values. The war continued to its inevitable conclusion. By the time Wattenberg completed his reduced rations, the Battle of the Bulge had failed. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat on all fronts, and Germany's defeat was merely a matter of weeks. The prisoners at Camp Papago Park received the news of Hitler's suicide and Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. Repatriation was gradual. Wattenberg remained in American custody until 1946, when he was transferred first to Camp Shanks in New York, then to a compound in the British zone of Germany near Münster. He was finally released and returned to civilian life, eventually becoming manager of the Lübeck branch of a German brewery. The U-boat commander who had survived the scuttling of the Graf Spee, the sinking of his submarine, and 36 days as a fugitive in the Arizona desert, lived quietly until his death in 1995 at the age of 94. Friedrich Guggenberger's post-war career was even more remarkable. The man who had
sunk the HMS Ark Royal, who had nearly reached the Mexican border before his capture, rejoined the West German Navy in 1956. He studied at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, the same United States he had once tried to escape, and rose to the rank of Konteradmiral, Rear Admiral. He served as Deputy Chief of Staff at NATO's Allied Forces Northern Europe, defending the same Western alliance his submarines had once attacked. He retired in 1972 and died in 1988, his body not discovered until 2 years later, after he wandered away from his home during a bout of Alzheimer's disease. The camp itself faded into memory. Buildings were demolished or sold as surplus. The land was divided between the Arizona National Guard, residential developments, and commercial properties. Today, a bronze marker along the cross-cut canal commemorates the tunnel exit, and concrete foundations of a few guard towers survive amid the encroaching Phoenix suburbs. The Great Papago Escape remains the largest breakout of Axis prisoners from any American facility during World War II. It is also, by any objective measure, a complete failure. Not a single man reached Mexico. Not a single man returned to the war. The most sophisticated escape plan ever attempted from an American POW camp was defeated not by guards or soldiers or searchlights, but by a cartographic misunderstanding, by rivers that existed only on paper, by a desert that proved far more formidable than any Allied naval patrol. There is something almost tragicomic about the image of those 3 U-boat officers standing in the darkness beside a dry riverbed, their carefully constructed raft suddenly worthless, their entire escape plan dissolving into the Arizona sand. They were brilliant submariners, men who had mastered some of the most complex and dangerous technology of their era, and they were defeated by the simple fact that they didn't understand how desert rivers work. But perhaps that's the real lesson of the Great Papago Escape. War produces extraordinary men capable of extraordinary feats, men who can survive depth charges and sink aircraft carriers and tunnel through Caliche that everyone said was impossible to dig. And war also reveals the limits of even extraordinary men when they venture beyond their expertise, when their maps no longer match the territory, when everything they know becomes useless in an unfamiliar landscape. The Salt River still runs dry through the Phoenix Valley for most of the year, except when winter rains or snowmelt fill the reservoir system to overflowing. The Tohono O'odham people, who helped track down the escaped prisoners, still live on their ancestral lands to the south and west. And somewhere in the quiet deserts north of Phoenix, the rocky outcrop where Wattenberg hid for over a month still stands, waiting for the next person who thinks they understand the landscape better than they do. If you found this story as remarkable as I did, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten corners of World War II history. Every like and share helps us continue bringing you these incredible stories that deserve to be remembered. Until next time.